Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Maria Coriel Martin and I'm the founder of Art Toolkit and so glad to have you joining us for another one of our live demo series. And today I'm just so happy to welcome our friend and artist Jared Cullum to share an introduction to gouache. Jared is an award-winning author, cartoonist, and plein air painter living in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and he has written and illustrated story and concept art for young adult and children's stories for Jim Henson Productions, IDW, Insight Editions, and others specializing in just beautiful hand-painted watercolor style. And Jared also regularly posts lessons and demonstrations on his YouTube channel, Jared Loves to Draw, and is just an avid outdoor painter and teacher of plein air and figure watercolor painting. Jared, we're just so excited to learn your approaches for painting with gouache, using it on the go, and are just really grateful to have you here with us.
Well, thanks for having me. It's an honor to get to sit down with y'all and talk about gouache.
Well, I was wondering, first of all, if you might just share a little bit of your background as an artist and how gouache has fit into that, how you've explored it. And I mean, we've painted with you before with watercolor, and maybe you could talk a little bit about how gouache has worked out for you.
Sure. Well, my main job is in kids' book illustration. So I spend a great deal of my time working in watercolor for that. And a lot of my sketching is with watercolor as well. And part of the kind of joy I get out of that is the immediacy of it, the effectiveness of how immediate the response is with it. So I was drawn to gouache because you have that similar immediacy to it as well. And if done well, you can get kind of the lush quality that an oil painting might have. I think gouache is a difficult one to handle because it is technically or chemically rather closer related to watercolor. Although in practice, I find it a little bit more related to oil painting. So you can get the same kind of, you know, approach and I guess, you know, thickness and opacity that oil has, but with the immediacy of watercolor as well, and also the once you get used to it, the erasability. So today we're going to be talking a lot about basically the long list of both pros and cons of gouache and how we have to embrace both. So there's nothing negative about it, but it is a finicky medium. So it's it falls apart quite easily. There's a lot of little things about it, but once you get used to those things, you can sketch very quickly and effectively.
Well, I've personally used white gouache for years in my practice for and love how it like plays nice with watercolor since like you mentioned they do share that sort of chemical makeup, the composition of water-based media. But I haven't like dived into as many colors very much, and I'm really excited to hear some of your approaches based on the
Sure,
challenges you've mentioned
sure.
along the.
That was kind of how I started with gouache. Um, well, so I started by using a little bit of white gouache just to correct watercolor paintings. And then I bought a nice set and I tried to do a gouache painting and I failed at it. And so I just sort of gave up on it for a little while. And then I came back to it and was able to kind of get used to some of that finicky sort of stuff that I was talking about.
And I just wanted to say, those of you watching live, I'll keep an eye on the chat. So if you've got questions, I'll do my best to get to them and relay them to Jared. And yeah, Jared, well, why don't we dive in a little more into
Yeah,
some of those pros and cons and how you've, your little tips and techniques for using it.
sure.
And we can
Let's
pull
get
up
into
your
it.
desk view. I'll get out of the way. And then we do have a link in the video description, our YouTube description, to a Dropbox folder that includes some reference images and a really neat little worksheet that Jared put together. So if you haven't had a chance to check that out, you can grab that.
All right, give me just a moment to wheel around over here.
And we do have one question while you're getting set up, if you're referring to
Sure.
acrylic gouache or regular gouache, and if you have a preference.
So I'm using gouache, not acrylic gouache. I've used acrylic gouache, and I like it fine. The difference with that is that it you can layer it once it dries sort of permanently like acrylic paint does. Where with gouache, you can kind of erase it if you need to by like re-wetting it. So this is my basic kind of tool set. This is my art toolkit I was going to use for today. And then this is my regular one for gouache. So if you're using gouache and you're using it in a palette, you'll find that it tends to get quite crumbly. So that's one of the cons I would say is when gouache is kind of best used fresh. So if you're pouring gouache into a box, into wells like watercolor, you can add like glycerine or some kind of chemical agent to help it get like dry smoother. But typically it sort of dries into this kind of chalky, um, you know, chalky bits, cakey bits, and they'll kind of fall out. The other thing you might run into is it might pour out too if you close it and throw it in your bag. So unless you're doing a whole lot of gouache, I don't necessarily recommend you pour it directly into a box on metal pans. Um, One of the benefits of gouache is that it dries quite quickly. That's why it kind of had a heyday in the golden age of illustration because you can erase it. So if you're doing a sketch and you don't like it, you could spray it with water and then wipe it back down to the page. That's one of the benefits of gouache. It's also one of the cons of gouache because it's so erasable, you can have a spot in the painting that you like and then have a little bit too much water on the brush and accidentally erase part of your painting. So you just have to be careful. But the main thing with gouache is just getting used to the consistency. So getting the right consistency with gouache. Um, my preferred way to use gouache here is to take a piece of paper towel. So if you take a piece of paper towel and then you roll it up like this. So it's like a 1 inch wide kind of width by the width of the paper towel. And then you take your water cup. Sorry, my voice is a little bit shaky. I'm kind of recovering from a cold, so.
Oh, no worries. There's been loads of stuff going around.
So you dip the paper towel in the water cup, and then you have a wet kind of surface, and you could just lay that in. And that gives you a surface that, like, I've put gouache on a wet paper towel like this, and then left it and kind of forgot about it overnight, came back the next day, and the paint was still wet on it. So one of the first things you'll run into that's kind of a headache with gouache is if you're not moving fast enough with the gouache, it will dry on your pan. So if it's taking, if you're getting used to the medium, so it might take you a little bit longer to, complete a sketch, your paint will harden on the pan, and then it becomes kind of a pain to have to kind of dig at it to get your color out. But if you wet a paper towel and create a sort of wet sponge, then when you pour your paint out onto it, it creates just a kind of damp surface. It's also always good to have a spray bottle handy because you can spray it too to kind of keep the paint alive. I'll just pour out some colors here.
And so are you doing this fresh each time then, or you showed us a little contrast of your different palettes?
I tend to do both. My preferred, like the most comfortable sketching is to use it fresh like this.
Mm-hmm.
It's just kind of the realistic, um, it's just sort of best fresh from the tube. But it's not impossible to re-wet and use it once it's hardened. That's kind of why I like to have one set where I don't mind having it wet or dried in it. Because if I'm doing like a small series of sketches, and I mean like business card sized,
Mm-hmm.
which I like to do, If I'm doing it about that size, then the gouache works really well, just re-wetting it and working small. So if I'm doing like, you know, kind of composition studies or just trying to get ideas down and I'm working sort of small, then it works really well to re-wet it. But other than that, if you're trying to paint any bigger than business card sized or, small sketchbook size, I find it to be kind of a headache to re-wet it. It's not quite the same as watercolor in that regard.
And Jared, would you mind sharing a bit about when you prefer to use gouache versus watercolor? We've got a question from Lisa. Is it mostly about the look you're going for and just thinking about the different approach?
Sure. Um, that's a really good question. I guess the answer is the look, I guess. I'm not exactly sure. I haven't really thought about it. I just kind of I like the way gouache dries with this sort of soft matte surface. There's like a nice kind of like lushness to that. Uh that I kind of prefer even to oil painting, to be honest. Um, and sometimes I think it's also just a different mentality, which we'll get into in the actual sketching part. Um, the mentality of sketching with gouache, like I was saying, is similar to sketching with oil. So you can get the kind of, I guess, the thought process that might go with sketching with oil. So we're always still thinking about value, which is what we're going to talk about now. So I'm still thinking about value the same way I would if we were looking at a watercolor or using transparent watercolor. But it's the approach, the thought of the approach is slightly different. So instead of thinking about it as like, stepping down deeper into value, as in like lightest into middle into darkest, and subdividing that way, with gouache, I can kind of throw down a middle and then work my way up or down with value, which we'll get into. So once I have the gouache on the palette, and I use Imgram or Daniel Smith gouache. Um, and yeah, so the main thing with gouache, I think, is that you kind of have to go easy on yourself a little bit and understand that it's a sketching medium. And the initial intent of gouache was for sketching. So the word gouache comes from the Italian word guazzare, which means to sketch with paint. So the idea is that gouache is this sort of cheaper version of your pigments and colors that you can use so that, you don't waste your precious, expensive oil paints, so you can figure out all your color and stuff. So if you got the reference, the first thing I sent was like a little worksheet. So I just thought we could talk through the kind of technical aspects of gouache before we get into using the gouache. So the first thing I like to talk about is consistency, which is the biggest difference between gouache and watercolor. So for gouache, my favorite, or I guess the best working consistency for gouache is next to no water at all. So to have um, any water in gouache greatly weakens the strength of the gouache and it makes it kind of transparent. So it's not an issue in the first kind of layers if you're putting down some colors, so if you have some water in the gouache like this, if you go to put that down, it's going to end up quite kind of transparent. The problem with that is that gouache is quite loose and finicky, so it tends to lift very easily. So if you're trying to put multiple layers of something to like build up value or build up color in some way, saturation in some way, if you go at it with a little bit too much water, you run the risk of raking previous layers up and it kind of mixes it again and it can make a kind of muddy mess. That's kind of the most consistent thing I see students struggle with is they'll have a gouache sketch that has that has too many muddy parts where the paint kind of lifted the lower layers up. So what you want to get in the habit of is keeping a handy kind of paper towel, or my favorite thing to use is these flour sack cloths because you can just wash them in a washing machine. Um, if you keep one handy, you can tap off the excess water and get used to getting it to the point where you have a good, like, strong thickness to the gouache like this. So it takes a little practice, but what you want is enough water in the brush to move the gouache around, but you also want the gouache to be opaque going down. So that's that mentality switch I was talking about. It's beneficial to think of it more like painting with oil and mineral spirits than like watercolor with water. So if this was mineral spirits and you were using it to kind of break up the oil paint, if it was like liquid or something that you were using as a additive to break up the paint, you don't want to use too much, because you'll end up with this really like sloppy mess and it's hard to get the paint to mix any afterwards. So you just want to use a little bit of water. Usually I'll clean the brush and then tap it off on the paper towel. But you want enough that makes strong, opaque.
Oh, wow. That looks like a nice sort of creamy consistency that you have going on there.
Yeah, exactly.
And Jared, we've got a couple questions about brushes. If you use a brush that might not be as a traditional watercolor brush, maybe it holds less water. I know in the supplies we listed, you mentioned flat brushes.
Hmm.
Do you have any thoughts around using the same brushes or different ones?
Sure. Um, I actually don't like using watercolor brushes with gouache because it's too soft. You need something that kind of pushes. I find the watercolor brushes tend to be quite soft, so it doesn't quite have the push you need. So my preferred brush, honestly, are like cheap synthetics. Oops, where are you at? Cheap synthetics. Because they just push the gouache better. Um,
Mhm.
I find basically any synthetic is good, but the natural hair watercolor brushes tend to be too soft. So it's hard to get because you want to work in this like creamy consistency, like you said. And if you are using a really soft brush, it won't quite like push the medium around.
Oh, that makes a ton of sense and might also hold more water and make it harder to get some of that more opaque paint, perhaps, too.
Right. So the next thing I want to take a look at is let's lay out some value here. So I usually like to have students do this, which is create a little value scale that you can cut out. So what I want to do is try to find a 50-50 ratio of ivory black in this case and white. I happen to be using titanium white, but I just want to look for about 50-50 ratio.
This is such a helpful exercise, Jared. I've done this before with you, and value, you can never practice value too much, in my opinion.
I agree. And I find, you could go to the store and buy one of these for like, or you could just make one of these yourself and cut it out and just tape it to your, if you make a real small one, you can tape it to your drawing board or keep it in your toolkit bag or whatever. And then when you're out, you can hold it up. I can hold this up to my reference and judge like, is this area lighter or darker and work my way around that way. So I go for about 50-50, which would be about there. And then I can work my way lighter by adding some white to it. And it helps to start getting used to doing this, what I'm doing now, which is mixing in trails. So mixing away from my kind of core spot. Because that way I get like a little breadcrumb trail. So if I go too far, I can know my way back. Maybe
I've
a
never
little bit
heard that
more.
described just like that, but it makes total sense, Jared. What a wonderful visual.
Something like that, maybe. Could probably use a little bit more dark. But I'm trying to get this creamy consistency. Okay. Clean the brush. And then I can go back and add some ivory black and go for split that difference a little bit. So something like that. And then that last step would just be straight ivory black. So the lightest you could go would be the white of the page. So you could choose to leave some areas white. We're going to talk about mixing with white next. That's the biggest kind of the biggest hurdle, I think, which I want people to take away from this, is getting used to the consistency issue of gouache. But once you get past that, the next big hurdle is mixing white, which can be very um, frustrating because white is a cooling agent. It neutralizes color. So where with transparent watercolor, we have the white of the page and translucency. If we're using white to mix and white is neutralizing the color, we have to figure out how to mix using white without neutralizing and killing colors.
Jared, I've got two questions for you. One is just a little bit of a technical question around gouache that someone has experienced. They had a problem with mildew with gouache in pans that were in an airtight palette.
Oh
Have you
yeah.
ever had experience with this or added anything to the paints to prevent it?
Oh yeah. um, yeah, so that's another con with gouache. Um, I have like to do bigger pictures. I have a little box that I use and I keep the paints in it. Um, if you're going to use one of those airtight things, this is part of why I recommend doing the paper towel method. Because if you're going to put it in a box, if you close that box, especially depending on the how humid the place you live in is, it's going to get mildewy, and kind of ruin the paints. So the only real solution to that is every time I use this box, I leave it out and open until it thoroughly fully dries all the way through. So then it sort of turns into that little chalky kind of bits, you know? Um, but you could still spray that with water and then use a toothpick and swirl it back to kind of pancake mix consistency and bring it back. But if you close the box and leave it, it's going to get mildewy. So if you're using an airtight thing, if you're painting on a trip or something and you're painting every day for like 2 or 3 days in a row, then you're fine to close the lid and like reuse it. But just if you're going to stop painting for like more than a day, you have to leave it out and let it dry all the way through, or otherwise it'll get mildewy. But yeah, that's a common thing. I don't know of what kinds of things you could add to it to get it to not do that. But I'm sure there's something.
Yeah, we just
But
got a comment from Amanda in the chat saying someone suggested clove bud oil as an antifungal. So I'll just say if anyone does experiment and learn something, pop a
yeah.
comment, and we love learning. And Jared, you got my next question, which was just on kind of that rehydration, where I'm working with a palette with gouache that's been in my pans. So I've been spraying it just to kind of reconstitute it to get those juicier or richer colors, I suppose.
Hmm. I think I don't know. I'm like a slow turning ship when it comes to experimenting or adding things. So anytime I think about like adding stuff to it, which is I'm all for it, but I always like am afraid it's going to mess up the consistency of what it usually does. So it always keeps me from being super, you know, experimental with it.
Fair enough. Plus, don't want to damage the paper too.
So let's say we have like a red apple, right? So the local color is red. So we get this bright red, and I get that red, and we mix that and we put it down. Maybe I'll try to come in a little bit. Okay. So now we're going to turn the form to another spot. So something that's going to come up a lot is talking about turning form. So I'm always trying to think about how um, when you're looking at objects, light is hitting that object, right? So you've got usually two or more light sources. So there's typically some kind of warm light source and or cool light source, and then some kind of fill or ambient light source. So if it's indoors, maybe it's an incandescent bulb, and then a distant like window could be an ambient cool light source. But the light is hitting the object, and that object can then be broken into kind of planes. So I try to always think about things like this uh, piece of foam core that I made, um, where I have multiple spotlights on, so it's kind of put there. So I try to always think about how light is hitting an object, and then as we move around that object, every time we move from plane to plane, the light gets a little bit, it's hitting the object a little less or a little more, and it's getting either warmer or cooler as we move across the object. So that's going to come up later. Um, so let's say we're turning the form, we're moving towards the light source, so it's getting warmer. I go, okay, I know how to do this. I lighten the value. We'll take some white here. I'll add it to the red. It's a lighter red, and then I put it down, and it looks dull and kind of gray and pink and not correct. So, what we have to get in the habit of doing is constantly going back with some sort of warming agent. So, we take the red, too much water, gotta let go of some of that water. We take our red, and then I'll add a little white to lighten the value, but then I need to add some bright yellow to bring some warmth back into it, and a little bit of red. And then it just becomes this kind of interplay back and forth where we add a little bit of white, and then I have to add a little bit of yellow, in this case, azo yellow, and a little bit of red. And now we can move to a lighter value that keeps warmth and color character. So you want to be careful because when you're mixing with the white, it's very easy for your gouache sketch to become kind of milky looking. And it's almost like the thing, it's been like splashed with bleach sometimes because you have too much white in everything. If you want just a general practice, it's a good general practice um, to get used to sketching or everything without white first. So see how much you can get down without using any white at all. And you'll learn a lot that way. You'd be surprised at how far you can go.
Oh, Jared, that is such a helpful tip to be aware of how white cools and to add that warm. That I've definitely experienced that, and in thinking about that sort of overuse or cooling overall milkiness of just white. Um, yeah, brilliant suggestion.
All right, so I'm gonna put some more red back. My my white's kind of getting away from me. Okay, so oh, and then the last thing I was going to talk about was the saturation. So color saturation. So, without getting into it, because I feel like we could, spend like weeks talking about it. We also want to be aware of desaturating colors or keeping colors within a controlled sort of range. So most colors are not like candy shop colors, like way on the outside of the wheel. So even like a squash or something, not a lot of the squash would be this like crazy kind of bright yellow. Or something that's green wouldn't typically be like a crazy bright green because there's light, warm and cool colors that are bouncing off of everything constantly. So um, it's a good practice to experiment with ways of desaturating colors. So figure out the range you have for something like a green, for example, and your methods for desaturating that color. So if I have a green that's fairly bright, and green can be obnoxious to get off the brush. It's good to get used to ways of desaturating that color. So if you're um, using a very limited range of colors, then of course you could use the opposite color. So you could use a little bit of red, but I just would caution you that using the complementary colors, that is a good way to mix colors, but it's a very strong way to mix colors. So if you're to do that, I would recommend using just a little bit at a time. So tiny, tiny bits at a time, mixing in trails so that you can keep your breadcrumbs kind of. But another way that I've tended to do is just by using some kind of convenient colors like yellow ochre, which has a limited range of its saturation. So if you use something like a yellow ochre um, or a burnt umber, which is sort of a brown orange, you can desaturate your colors. I tend to my go-to for um, most of my kind of general color mixing for a gray is ultramarine and burnt sienna or burnt umber for my like if you need like jet black, like as dark as it gets, I use ultramarine and burnt umber. That's kind of my go-to.
Jared, would you mind moving your paper and palette over a little so we can see the full
Oh,
range
sure.
of your palette? Oh, perfect.
I think I just got to zoom. I was
Zoom
zooming
out
in
if
and I
that works.
forgot.
Um,
Um, all right, so let me take a look at some stuff to sketch.
and we've got one other sort of practical question of using gouache. Someone has commented that they've heard it's best to use distilled water to constitute gouache. Have you had this experience or do you know the reason?
Oh, I don't honestly know any. I'm just to be honest, I don't know anything about that. That sounds like it would be a very smart thing to do. I kind of use anything. Um, I guess I'm not really. I mean, I would use whatever I had near me. So just use sink water to be honest. I've never thought about the water to be honest, but that's an interesting um, thought. The only thing I've put thought into is after you've finished a painting. Um, by the way, we'll take a look at this banana. I don't know that we quite have enough time to get into light effects, so maybe because I'd like to have time to get to the landscape too, because that way we get the range of objects and landscapes. Um, but I think the only thing I put thought into, I've never had an issue with water causing a problem. I'm not really sure what maybe other than maybe it damaging it in the long run, but I don't really typically do gouache paintings or sketches with the mentality that like this is going to be hung in a gallery, or something. Like I tend to do it as a sketch, um, and to sketch rapidly. So I don't tend to think about like longevity necessarily. But there probably are people who do. Um, it's more about I guess, quantity, I guess, for me. But I think the one thought that I do put into it is that it's because it's more of a sketching medium, it may not be quite as light fast or strong over time as something like oil paint. So I do put thought into varnishing the gouache. So there's multiple kind of methods for that, which I would recommend you take a look at. So if you do a gouache sketch that you're happy with, um, if I do one that I like to varnish it. So there's multiple methods to do that. You can there's I like to use this Krylon music. It's called Krylon UV Archival. Here, actually, I can let me grab it real quick.
Well, Jared's grabbing that. I'm just going to post a comment in the chat with the paper recommendations that he gave us for these are in the video descriptions too. I'll pop those in the chat now.
So this is like my preferred um, varnish. So I like this stuff. You just kind of spray it on and it protects it, keeps it from yellowing and um, fading. So I like this stuff. If it's a gouache sketch that like, maybe sells or something off Instagram, or I like it and I'd like to keep it, then I like to spray it with this archival varnish. The other methods are there's like a wax. I forget the brand. I don't have the wax varnish, but I've seen people like Craig Stevens who on Instagram demo using a wax varnish. So Craig Stevens and Brianne Brown is a watercolor artist, and both of them have demos on using a wax varnish. I don't have a lot of experience with that, but it looks great, and it seems like it would be great. Kind of goes on. Um, you just kind of like, it looks like a what you would varnish an oil painting with. Okay, so let's take a look at this banana as a quick example. So I'm going to do a quick drawing here. And I'm mostly thinking about kind of the silhouette here. So I don't want to get too carried away with rendering it because I want to allow the gouache to kind of do part of it. I think that's part of the process that I enjoy about gouache, um, as opposed to watercolor, is thinking of things sculpturally as opposed to uh, building up the value kind of map. Where with gouache, I can think about things kind of sculpturally. So, like I showed with that example of the foam core thing, I can kind of walk my way across an object. So I like to kind of think of it like I'm a little ant or something, which I think is an example from James Gurney's book, Color and Light, which is he talks about thinking about light or the effect of light on an area by picturing yourself as a small ant walking across the object and looking up as a way to kind of analyze light. So I kind of like that for gouache as well. So thinking about this, like these little facets, these little planes, um, you know, one thing I often mention, oops, I think I hit you guys. Um, one thing I always go back to, which was kind of a really silly thing when I was a kid, was this music video. And I remember it just used to be on all the time, which was on like VH1, which I don't think is a thing anymore. But there is this so I'm just going to pre-wet this, by the way, and then I'm going to stain the whole thing just to get rid of the white. So I'll get back to that idea in a second. So I'm going to take some yellow ochre and maybe a cool too. So some ultramarine maybe. So what I'm doing is I'm just getting rid of the white here. So I could set down some kind of a local color for the bananas. Maybe tone it down some with some ultramarine and burnt umber. Okay. So this is kind of my preferred method for using gouache, which is to stain the page to get rid of the white and then start to build the planes of these objects. This is what I was talking about thinking about things sculpturally. So moving from um, plane to plane. So basically establish a plane or an area and then move to the next. Like, so we'll say like a pixel is probably a better example of a word. So if I establish this like pixel here, and then I can move to the next pixel, so to speak, and ask myself, is it lighter or darker? And is it warmer or cooler? And I can work my way around this kind of patchwork thinking sculpturally. So it's like a different mentality than, say, with watercolor, where I'm trying to strategize a overall kind of value scheme, uh, you know, looking for the large middle value and then subdividing my darks within it. In this case, I can kind of think sculpturally about the object, moving around the object and observing those planes. And I try to, in my own work, which, it might be a little bit more loose than what I think some people prefer, you know, I tend to paint a little bit loosely. And I like to use big brushes too, as much as possible. Let me clear a little area here. So I like to use bigger brushes. On regular sketches, I tend to like to use like a 1 inch flat. Um, but I stain the page, and then from here on out, I'm going to try to stay in that zone, that consistency that I was talking about, where it is all next to no water. So constantly kind of tapping off the excess water, so I'm not lifting up lower layers, and I can build out my, little sketch here. Um, so I'm going to establish a kind of color here. But what I was talking about the silly music video, when I was a kid, there was this kind of silly, stupid music video by the Dire Straits called Money for Nothing. And it's like really old computer graphics. So it's really, really blocky. Everything looks blocky. So all the little characters moving around are like, everything is like super, super old computer graphics, like 3D graphics rather. Early, whatever, whenever that was, middle 80s computer graphics. So it's all really blocky and kind of, terrible by today's standards. But I don't know, my mind always goes there, or maybe Toy Story 1, when it's like old computer graphics, when things weren't quite, as smooth and perfect seeming as they are now with computer graphics. And everything was quite blocky. And my mind always goes back to that. I remember seeing that constantly, that music video. It's kind of burned in my mind, the really blocky computer graphics. So I like to kind of look at the object I'm looking at and almost imagine it in that kind of like late 80s computer 3D graphics um, kind of thing. So I've got this yellow here. So if I so we have part of it is in shadow here. So I've got a plane facing this way, and it looks like it's sort of matched on this side too. Add a little bit more yellow ochre. And it kind of falls. So now if I move into the turn, it's starting to turn away from that light source behind it, which is a window. So it's falling into a little bit of shadow. So I can use a little burnt umber here, maybe a little ultramarine because it's getting a little bit kind of greenish, you know?
Jared, I'm assuming that your paint is your brush is so just loaded with paint that you're not experiencing any real bleed either, if your paper's still damp.
Yeah. Well, this has pretty much dried while I was talking. So now I've got this area and then this area that kind of goes into shadow. Maybe I can get this to blend a little bit better here. So then I've got the shadow that kind of moves along here. So I get some yellow ochre. And I don't want to get it too gray, so I'm going to add some of that bright yellow to it. But there's a kind of shadow side facing outward, and that kind of works its way this way. And down. Like that. And then there's a quite dark shadow plane. So banana is kind of handy because it's sort of broken into planes. So if I add some burnt umber, I'm going to keep it warm because light's hitting the cutting board and bouncing up into the lower planes. There's a little bit of a tiny plane beneath it there. And I missed that plane. I have to come back for it. But there's a little bit of that kind of shadow plane over here too. Right here. I'll go back to my.
Gosh, Jared, we could do a whole workshop on this of noticing planes of light and dark. I can just see how practiced you are at laying down these areas of gouache. And it is so different from watercolor, it seems, with these just bigger strokes and
Yeah, I
values
think,
and Mhm.
yeah, I think that's kind of what I like about it is I like thinking about it a little bit differently. Um, so that shadow plane is picked up over here. So
And your
this one
analogy to
over.
oil paints, it seems more additive of adding these layers, and then I assume you can add it on those brights versus, protecting the paper.
Right. Which goes like that. Okay.
We do have just one question on kind of the technical side of, do you suggest glycerin or another watercolor medium when you do have it dried in your palette to help with crumbling?
There's a lot of YouTube videos on people who talk about using that. My friend Lena Revo has a good demo of using uh oof. I had it nearby and I don't know where I put it because I bought it. I watched a friend Lena did a video on this Winsor Newton water media stuff and how it helps all those problems and makes the gouache even smoother. And I got it, but honestly I'm so like chicken about not understanding, not knowing my materials. I always like default to what I know works for me. So I haven't really experimented a lot, to be honest. So then I've got, sorry, a little burnt umber and ultramarine.
I'll chime in with some watercolors and a little bit of gouache. I've used a drop of glycerin, but really sparingly to help it kind of stay in my pans. But I have been sparing because I've found if you use, in my experience, limited experience, here's my disclaimer, that too much will just result in kind of sticky paints.
That makes sense. So you might have noticed that I have not used really any white yet because I'm kind of avoiding it to get to a certain point. So now we're going to have to work into the light. So let's turn this form now and move into the light a little bit. So I'm going to have to use my bright color. I've got two light sources happening. There's one above our head to the right. You can kind of see this happening on the cutting board. You know how it's warm over here and how see how parts of the shadow are quite warm? That's because the light source above our head this way is a kitchen light above my head, like a spotlight almost. And then off to the left, we have a cool light. That's because there's a window over there. So we've got some areas, like the top of the bananas, that are getting hit by this ambient cool light. Maybe even the back of the banana back here a little bit. And then we have little bits of the banana that are facing away from us that are catching a little cool light. So like if you look here, this plane is facing towards the window light. So it's like a little bit cool. And then this plane is facing towards the kitchen light. So it's a little bit, it's light and bright and warm. And then what's interesting is that we because it's a banana, we curl back up. So this is sort of getting a little bit of both, but it's facing back towards that window. So it's catching a little bit of that cool light too. So let's see, get my yellow here. And I'm going to use a little bit of white to kind of start lightening and getting a lighter value. And as I add white on the areas that I want to have in intense saturation, I'll keep adding bright yellow to it to counteract the white. But on the other sides, it's okay to let the white kind of neutralize it a little bit because that, you know, that color is being desaturated a little bit. So this area, for example, is getting a little bit more of a warmer light. We can put some of these planes in.
I'm really enjoying with your sketch, Jared, how I mean, the word that comes to mind is painterly also, in that you're really getting that record of the brush marks and using that thicker paint. I feel like you can really see every mark much more clearly than, say, the comparison with watercolor.
That's what I like about gouache. That's kind of something that I sort of try to preserve as best I can. Um, even to a fault maybe, because I think it might tend to look a little bit loose uh in some cases, but this I like that about gouache. So I'm not using the warming agent now because I'm getting into this area that's getting the window light. So we go there. There's the back side of this one. So it catches the light back here. Like that. And then even a little bit lighter back here. Like that. And some of that really light just on the end here. It gets really light, or it's really turning up. So this area is kind of in the middle. And if I close an eye and squint, that's kind of the key, is to kind of keep closing an eye and squinting at your um, subject. So you can close one eye, gets rid of depth perception, squint gets rid of the detail, so you can focus on um, just the big broad shapes. If I go back to my mix, there's a kind of a yet darker part. I want to keep the yellow ochre though in it because I don't want it to lose saturation completely. But there is like a little bit darker of a spot in here. Or this one comes down and splits the area here between those two. So I put it down and I realize closing an eye and squinting. Closing an eye and squint here, there's just a little bit more to it. So I'm going to add a little more burnt umber. If I need to go darker, I can add a little ultramarine to that. There, that has a little bit more power to it. And I can use that to kind of define this shape here. Like that.
Jared, would love if you could zoom in at some point too. We can take a little closer look. They're just popping off your page now. Oh, beautiful.
That's what I like about gouache. It's kind of, to me, honestly, like I think my favorite part about gouache is the that like exploration. You know, it might sound a little silly, but that the kind of ant-like exploration. I think part I got kind of deeper into it because part of the problem that you run into when you're painting in general, regardless of the medium, is that our brain has a very preconceived idea of everything, right? So we build this kind of library of shapes and symbols, since you're a baby. That's part of how we navigate the world and simplify the kind of, insane complexity that is reality. We break it down into sort of symbols and things, but it becomes a problem when you're painting because if I'm just painting this thing, my brain goes, I know what a banana looks like. So in the split milliseconds between me looking at the subject and looking at my painting, my brain goes, I know what a banana looks like. And it'll try to draw, you know, banana, symbol of banana. And it won't look quite right. I run into that a lot teaching plein air. People will do cars, will do a street scene, and people will do this, you know, and go, I don't know why it doesn't look right. It feels like almost like a child's drawing of a car. Well, it's because your brain is going into autopilot and trying to say, I know what a car looks like, and it will generate this kind of symbol. And in portraiture, people tend to do like eyes like this, and they'll go, I don't know why it looks like a cartoon. Well, it's because your brain is going in autopilot. It goes, I know what an eye looks like. And it's forcing this symbol of an eye rather than what you really see when you look at someone's eye, which is not an eyeball like that. You tend to see a series of overlapping values. So, um, experimenting with gouache is a great way to explore kind of like getting into the wiring in your own mind and and kind of manually disconnecting some of those um you know connections. It's like going into your brain and choosing to disconnect those things, and then I find my best paintings are when I can remove myself from the awareness of what the object is that I'm sketching, to get away from being aware of what the object is, if that makes sense, which I realize is starting to sound a little bit like woo woo or whatever. But get away from being aware of what the object is and just get kind of lost in this exploration, like I was talking about, where we are kind of exploring the planes of this, you know, poor late 1980s graphics uh, object.
Oh, Jared, that's a really poetic way of putting this whole approach. And I can't believe how fast our time has just flown by for our demo together. And I think we'll have to explore doing some more gouache with you in the future.
Sure.
I love this sculptural approach and appreciate you taking the time to paint with all of us. Can you let folks know some of the ways to keep in touch with you and if there's anything we should know about coming up?
Sure. Well, I'm really active on Instagram and usually on YouTube as well, with lessons and that kind of thing for both gouache and transparent watercolor. But other than that, yeah, I'm just around on the social media stuff and always happy to answer questions and stuff.
And we've posted your Instagram and your website in the description to this video. And I just have to ask while we're online, I'm a big fan of your book, Cody. Um, and last time I talked with you,
Thanks.
you're working on a sequel, is that right?
I am. I'm finishing the sequel right now. So I am I'm on like the last lap of or the last mile of the marathon, so to speak. So I'm trying to have it finished by the end of the year.
Wow. Well, I, for one, am really excited for it. And if anyone hasn't checked out Jared's children's graphic novel, Cody. It's done in watercolor, just these stunning illustrations that range from Pacific Northwest Seattle area up to Alaska. And I just love it, Jared, and can't wait to see what you've been creating.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's just pull up our cameras for one more minute. We'll give a little wave to everybody. And I just hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day. And
Thank
want to
you.
thank you again for giving us this just wonderful respite into painting and exploring gouache. And can't wait to do more.
Yeah, thank you all. It's really an honor always to get a chance to talk with you all. And I love talking about this stuff. So I'm always happy to, am I back on? Hey, happy to answer any questions, and I'm always around.
Wonderful. Well, take care, everybody, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks.
Wow, Jared, I could keep painting all day with you.